there is a lot at stake for you in this struggle, either to destroy the naval hopes of the Peloponnesians, or to bring nearer home to the Athenians their fears for the sea. Let me remind you once more that you have defeated most of this fleet already, and beaten men never quite have the same resolution as they had before when they come up against the same danger for a second time. Phormio addressing the Athenian fleet in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. Hello, I'm Mark Selleck and welcome back to Casting Through Ancient Greece, episode 79, Victories of Phormio. With us now in the third year of the war, we have seen somewhat of a pattern set in, with how the Peloponnesian War is unfolding. Athens would remain behind their walls in a defensive posture when it came to the Peloponnesians' offensive operations, while they would target the Peloponnesians through raids of their coastline, avoiding the mainland forces and attempting to secure more allies in the process. In addition to this, the Athenians would be focused up in the north in the Chalcidice, where revolt and diplomatic manoeuvrings were taking place. Sparta, on the other hand, were attempting to take the offensive to the Athenians, invading their territory to induce them out from behind their walls to engage in a hoplite battle. However, this continued ravaging of Attica was failing to achieve the desired results. While away from Athenian territory, the Peloponnesians would react to the activities Athens would be engaged in on the western coast of Greek lands. Last episode, we saw that the siege of Potidaea that developed before the breakout of the Peloponnesian War would finally come to a resolution. This conflict was draining Athens of manpower, resources, and money that could be better used in countering the Spartans. Athenian morale was dropping as the siege continued on with no end in sight. The main force had seen fresh troops come and go, with the only effect being the introduction of the plague into an army that had yet been exposed to it. However, the state of the defenders was even worse, and they would seek terms to see the siege ended. The Athenian commanders would agree to terms that were lenient to the defenders, seeing them have safe passage out into the wider Chalcidice. The Athenian government was displeased with the general's acceptance, believing a more complete surrender could have been achieved. Though the Athenians seemed to have been glad to rid themselves of the siege, and the generals would rid themselves of the charges against them. This resolution at Potidaea would see the close of the second year of the war. Though, with the opening of the third year, more actions would follow with the coming of the campaigning season. Sparta would leave the Peloponnesians back out through the Corinthian Isthmus, but this time Attica would not be the target of their operations for this year. Instead, they would march onto Plataea, who, caught between a rock and a hard place, would attempt to negotiate their position between Sparta and Athens. Plataea would end up being forced into having to resist the Peloponnesian army, who would attempt to assault the city, though after a number of failed attempts, a state of siege would develop around the small polis. To then close out the episode last time, we saw that Pericles, who had been so influential in Athenian politics for a generation, would meet his tragic end. During the plague, he would witness the death of his sister and two legitimate sons. This would lead to a crisis in his family line. Though slowly declining from his own contraction of the plague, Pericles would be able to secure citizenship for his illegitimate son, also named Pericles. This would see that the assembly would make an exception to the citizenship policy Pericles himself had introduced into the 450s. In September of 429 BC, the man who had shaped Athenian policy and helped the city reach its height in power would succumb to the plague that had already killed so many of his fellow Athenians. This episode will be remaining in the year of 429, as there was so much more taking place than just the events we covered the previous episode. Although the siege of Potidaea had come to an end, much of the Chalcidice was still hostile to the Athenians. Athens had sent out colonists to resettle Potidaea after it was abandoned, but to follow this up, a new operation would be launched focusing on reducing the threat to Athenian interests. With the continuing of Athenian activities up north, we would find Thracian and Macedonian relations would continue to evolve. Another major action that would take place through the year will be the campaigns of the Peloponnesians. These would be focused on the western coastal areas, as well as into the Corinthian Gulf, and would see some of the first naval battles develop between Sparta and Athens. As we have covered, the city of Potidaea was up on the Chalcidice, this being Athens' main connection into the region. The wider region had become hostile to Athens, as the troubles with Potidaea had broken out. We had seen that many from around Potidaea had been given refuge in areas further north thanks to Perdiccas. Even though Perdiccas had swayed back and forward as an ally of Athens, the greater part of the Chalcidice was still hostile to Athens. Potidaea had surrendered at the end of 430 BC, which would see Athens back in control of the city. They had sent colonists back to resettle the city and regain Athens' foothold in the region. With this resettlement taking place over the winter, Athens would now need to focus on securing its position in the face of threats on the Chalcidices that still existed. With the coming of the campaigning season for the third year, Athens would now transition from the siege warfare that they had been so accustomed to operations more offensive in nature. We would hear that this offensive would be undertaken by 2,000 hoplites and 200 cavalry, with Xenophon, the son of Euripides, leading them. Their first move after having departed Potidaea was to march onto the city of Spartolus, which is thought to have existed in the northeast of the Chalcidices, not far from Olynthus, where we had seen Perdiccas take command of the cavalry force before the siege of Potidaea. The Athenian force would set about ravaging the land around the city, while it was hoped a surrender within the city would be forthcoming. Supposedly, there was a pro-Athenian faction inside, and they thought they would be able to secure the city for them, especially with the intimidating actions occurring outside. However, the other elements of the city would not be cowed by the Athenians' actions, and would send off for aid from Olynthus. Not long after this help was sought, a force of hoplites and other troops would arrive from Olynthus, and would enter Spartolus to help defend the city. With the defenders now in a stronger position, they would sally out and meet the Athenians in battle. It's interesting to note here, we get quite a fuller account of this battle outside Spartolus than we do of other seemingly larger engagements that we have covered. For this reason, I want to recount what Thucydides writes. The Chalcidian hoplites and their auxiliaries, who were with them, were defeated by the Athenians and retreated into Spartolus. But the Chalcidian cavalry and the light troops defeated the cavalry and the light troops of the Athenian side. The Chalcidians had a few pelters from Crusus, and immediately after the engagement, some more pelters from Olynthus came in support. When the light troops from Spartolus saw this, they gained fresh confidence, both from the arrival of the reinforcements and from the fact that they had held their own previously. They therefore launched another attack on the Athenians, in which they were supported by the Chalcidian cavalry and by the troops who had just arrived. The Athenians fell back in two divisions, which had been left to guard the baggage. Whenever the Athenians charged, their enemies gave way, and as soon as the Athenians began to retire, they fell upon them again and shot at them with their javelins. The Chalcidian cavalry also kept riding up and charging whenever they saw their chance. Indeed, they were largely responsible for causing panic amongst the Athenians, who were routed and then pursued for a considerable distance. It's interesting to note here that we have been used to hearing about battles where the hoplites have been the main feature of the army, and who would be the deciding factor. But we see here that it would be the cavalry and lighter troops that would decide the outcome and defeat the heavily armoured hoplites. As the Peloponnesian War would continue on, we will find that lighter armed troops will be much more influential in the battles that would unfold. This would also see the hoplite of the period before the war becoming lighter armoured, so they would become more mobile and flexible as lighter troops would begin to make up larger portions of the armies. So, as we saw, the result of this engagement would be an Athenian defeat. The surviving troops of the Athenians would make their way back to Potidaea. Once inside the city, envoys would be sent out so that a truce could be arranged for the Athenians to recover their dead. With the dust now settling from the battle, it would be discovered that 430 men had been killed, while Xenophon and 2 other generals had also been killed in the fighting. What is also interesting when it comes to the Athenians' operations here was the absence of any help from Athens' new allies, Perdiccas of Macedon and Chalcidice of Thrace. Thucydides gives no account around these absences, though we have seen Perdiccas had been an unreliable ally in the past, while Chalcidice, although having assisted Athens in the case of the Peloponnesian envoys, may not have been too enthusiastic at seeing Athenian influence return to the Thracian coast. When it comes down to it, it would seem these alliances were ones of convenience. However, we will also see in the coming winter, Chalcidice would march against Macedon, so perhaps preparations for a coming conflict between the two were in the works and might have impacted assisting Athens. Though for now, Athens would still have hold of Potidaea, but would fail in this operation to regain influence through the Chalcidices. This would be the extent of the operations in the Chalcidices on Athens' behalf for the coming season, so let's now turn to the west coast of the Greek mainland. We have seen over the past 2 years that operations had been taking place along the western coast around the Corinthian Gulf and the islands in the area. Athens had campaigned in this area where they would secure more allies in their league while they were raiding the Peloponnesian coast. While we then saw Corinth and Sparta attempt to remove this Athenian influence, though their attempts were not completely successful, and their efforts were not overwhelming by any means. We would also find that the regional cities would look to take advantage of the conflict and attempt to gain more territory for themselves at their neighbours' expense. The previous year, we saw these activities taking place on the Ambracian coast, just north of the Corinthian Gulf opening. Now, this summer, the Ambraciots and Chenonians would look to expand their influence in the area by removing the Athenians in turn. Though they would seek Spartan assistance, presenting their involvement as part of a grander strategy of protecting the Peloponnese. It's also possible here that Corinth may have been operating behind the scenes to push their agenda in the west, as they had many colonies in the region that were now under threat from Athens. A plan was proposed that would see simultaneous operations by land and sea directed in the region. This, it was argued, would see that the Acarnanians, who the Athenians had assisted the previous year, would not be able to unite to mount an effective defence. This would also be the first phase of the plan, where it was then put forward that with Acarnania captured, the islands of Zakynthos and Cephalonia would fall to the Spartans easily. With the western coast back under Spartan influence, the Peloponnese would become more secure, as it would be more difficult for the Athenians to operate their navy in the region. Then it would be put forward that operations deeper into the Corinthian Gulf, namely directed at Naupactus, would be possible. Thucydides would tell us that the arguments that were presented by the Ambraciots would be agreed to by the Spartans, while we would hear that the Corinthians were particularly enthusiastic. As we pointed out, Corinth would have a great interest in seeing these operations undertaken in the region, as it would remove Athenian influence from the areas where Corinth had interests. Sparta would have in command of the Peloponnesian force that would be involved the navarch Cinemus. He would set out from the Peloponnese with 1,000 hoplites, sailing through the Corinthian Gulf, past Naupactus, where the Athenian fleet was stationed, giving them the slip. An interesting point here is that Corinth and Sicyon had not departed with the Spartans, and were still getting ready. This is a point that we'll be bringing up again once we get to the battle that would end up developing between Athens and Sparta in the Gulf. Cinemus would then make for the shore of the island of Leucas, located just outside the opening of the Gulf. Here he would link up with the allies from Leucas, Ambracia, Anactonorium, and Epirus. Also, Perdiccas of Macedon had arranged to supply 1,000 troops for use in the coming campaign, showing once again his unreliable nature when it came to the Athenian alliance. It is possible here that the Athenian defeat up in the Chalcidice may have influenced his decision to aid the Peloponnesians, though these forces would end up arriving too late to take part. Once Sparta had linked up with all these allies, they did not wait around for the rest of the Peloponnesian fleet still at Corinth. They would launch their land campaign into Acarnania, where their target would be the largest city in the region, Stratus. On their march, they would sack another village on the road towards their prize that they saw as being key to the region. Cinemus believed that if Stratus fell, the rest of the region would quickly come over to the Peloponnesian side. However, a mixture of ill discipline and the enemy's clever use of the terrain would see that the attack on Stratus would fail. Thucydides would tell us that the non-Peloponnesian elements of Cinemus's force would advance onto the enemy, breaking away from the rest of the army. Though, here again we would find that the superior use of light troops by the enemy would see that these forces would be defeated through ambushes, seeing them retreat back to the rest of the army. The forces of Stratus would avoid attacking the main Peloponnesian force once it had come up and would harass them from a distance with slings. However, Cinemus's allies had taken heavy casualties and were severely demoralised. Perhaps if he had his reinforcements from Macedon, Corinth and Sicyon, he might have been able to continue the attack. But given that the state of his allies were in, and word of enemy reinforcements on their way, he had no choice but to fall back onto Oenade, who was friendly to the Peloponnesians. From here, the defeated force would end up sailing back to the Peloponnesian side of the Gulf, and the other allies would return to their cities. At the time that Cinemus had invaded Acarnania, the cities there had sent help to the Athenians stationed at Naupactus. Here Athens had 20 triremes, which were under the command of the general Phormio. We have seen Phormio previously, in passing, where he would share command during the Samian War in 440 BC. We also saw him lead a naval force to complete the blockade of Potidaea in 432, when he would also be involved in land operations on the Chalcidice. However, it would seem he would have a talent for naval operations, which we will soon see. The plea for help had made it to Phormio, though he was not able to leave his port in the current situation. It would appear he was fully aware that part of the Peloponnesian fleet was still at Corinth, readying to sail. While this was the situation, he could not leave Naupactus. If he did, it would then see this important city open to capture. It's also suggested here that there may be more to the Spartans giving Phormio the slip that we brought up just before. The historian Donald Kagan would write, "The wily Phormio may have deliberately allowed the fleet of Cinemus to go by in order to engage only part of the Peloponnesian forces. Had he tried to stop Cinemus, he might have had to deal with reinforcements from Corinth and Sicyon. When at last he chose to engage the reinforcing fleet, the Spartans were fighting in Acarnania." If this was the case, this would highlight a high level of strategic thinking, of what potentially lay ahead for Phormio. It is difficult to prove one way or another that this consideration was in his mind at the time, though given the level of tactical thinking that would occur in the upcoming naval battle, I lean towards the suggestion that Kagan puts forward as being very possible. Around the same time that Cinemus began his campaign into Acarnania, the fleet that was at Corinth had set out to join with the rest of the Peloponnesians. The Corinthians and Ciconians had set out fully laden, prepared for a land campaign with their ships acting as transports, rather than seeking out a fight on the sea. They would have known that Athens had 20 triremes at Naupactus, where they would have to sail past to link up with Cinemus. However, they must have thought that they should be safe from encountering a naval battle, as they outnumbered the Athenians more than 2 to 1, with their 47 ships. It would have been reasoned that Phormio wouldn't risk sailing out to meet them given the disparity in numbers, not to mention he was the only fleet in the area, and if it were defeated, Naupactus would be undefended. However, Phormio had other ideas. He waited for the Corinthian fleet to sail past his location as they followed the Peloponnesian coast. This part of the Gulf was quite narrow, and he was waiting for the enemy to reach the coastal city of Potidaea, where the Gulf widened. This appears to show that Phormio knew the Corinthians were fully loaded down with extra troops and supplies, making their ships less manoeuvrable. So if he could engage the fleet in more open waters, his lighter and more agile triremes, although outnumbered, would have a huge advantage. As the Corinthian fleet sailed past Naupactus, Phormio had set out with his fleet shadowing from a distance. But once the Corinthians reached Potidaea, they attempted to cross the Gulf to reach the northern shore, where they would need to disembark their land forces. This would be Phormio's chance to act. The fleet were now sailing out in open waters in one of the widest parts of the Gulf, and in waters to the Athenians' advantage. The Corinthians had thought that they had given Phormio the slip in the night, and probably why they attempted the crossing now. However, the Athenian fleet were sighted coming on at them, and they would be forced to turn and give battle. The Peloponnesians, led by the Corinthians, would adopt a defensive position, forming into a circular formation, with their prows, the front of their ships, facing outwards, and their sterns facing into the centre of the circle. This would see that no gaps would exist large enough for the Athenians to get amongst their formation. In the centre of the circle would be some of the lighter ships, where they would be protected, along with 5 triremes that were lighter than the rest. Their role was to race out and support or plug any gaps that would be created by the Athenians. Seeing the Peloponnesians take this action, Phormio now formulated his plan on how to deal with the enemy. Factoring in the situation of the enemy ships and his knowledge of the Gulf, he would have the Athenian ships sailing in line around the Peloponnesian circle, with them moving in closer and closer as they sailed their circles around the defenders. This started to have an effect of seeing the Peloponnesians tighten their defensive circle, as the Athenian ships gave the impression that they would ram their ships at any moment. The Peloponnesian circle got tighter and tighter, this being the desired result. As being so laden down and so close to one another, they would start fouling on one another if they tried to manoeuvre. Added to this would be the small ships in the centre now starting to be mixed in the defensive circle as it tightened. To cap things off, Phormio knew that a strong wind usually blew in from the Gulf as the day came on, and it would not disappoint him today. His manoeuvring and timing had now completely neutralised the numerical advantage the Peloponnesians had, and the advantage was now with the Athenians, who were now in a position to attack whenever they wished. Now that the Peloponnesians were in complete confusion, fouling each other and finding it impossible to manage their ships in the choppy water, Phormio now gave the signal to attack. Thucydides describes the battle. The Athenians attacked, and after the first sinking of one of the admiral's ships, went on to destroy every ship that they came across. In the general confusion, the enemy put up no sort of resistance, and fled to Patrae and Dimma in Achaea. The Athenians pursued them, capturing 12 ships and making prisoners of their crews. The Athenians would mark their victory by setting up a trophy on the coast off where they fought, and would dedicate a ship to Poseidon, giving thanks for the victory. After they had completed their victory rituals, they then sailed back to the port of Naupactus. Meanwhile, the defeated Corinthian fleet would make their way for the port of Cyllene in Elis, where the army of Cinemus would also sail back to after their defeat at Stratus. Back in Sparta, the defeat had been met with anger. The Peloponnesians had been humiliated in their first proper amphibious campaign of the war. With Cinemus being in overall command, he was held responsible for the failure. As we saw, the key decision that appears to have led to this campaign failing was the Peloponnesian fleet setting out in two separate forces. If they had left as a combined fleet, Phormio may have had no choice but to remain in port, given the overwhelming size of the Peloponnesians. While in Acarnania, Cinemus would have had a greater number of Peloponnesian forces, seeing that he would not have to place such a heavy reliance on the allies of the region. While, if he had waited for the Macedonians, this would have also increased his odds of success even more so. Now though, Sparta would send to Cinemus 3 advisors, a sign that they had lost confidence in his ability to lead the campaign on his own. One of the advisors that was sent was a Spartan we have met before, this being Brasidas. The advisors had arrived with orders that preparations were to be made for another battle on the sea, and to not be driven from the sea by a few ships. It appears here the Spartans had viewed that cowardice was to blame for the defeat, not being able to understand how such a small force could defeat them. Thucydides suggesting that perhaps the Spartans had yet to grasp the tactics of fighting at sea, with this being their first real naval engagement in generations. The Peloponnesians would then begin preparations by making repairs to their surviving ships, while also seeking reinforcements from the cities of the Peloponnesian League. While Sparta was responding to the defeat and preparing for another attack, Phormio would send a message back to Athens with news of his victory over the Peloponnesian fleet. He also knew that the Spartans were preparing their fleet for another attack, so had requested that Athens send him as many ships as they could to reinforce his current fleet. The Athenians would respond by sending Phormio an additional 20 triremes, though they would have orders to stop off at Crete and take the city of Cydonia. When looking at a map, we can see that this diversion is quite out of the way, with the fleet needing to head south, where, to link up with Phormio, they would need to head west and then north around the Peloponnese, before then entering in the Corinthian Gulf. This pit stop on their journey has puzzled historians, as Thucydides provides no real reasoning for this attack, especially at such a crucial time given Phormio's situation. For the time being, a couple of possible reasons have been put forward, ranging from Athens attempting to secure trade routes, and diverting Sparta's attention since the city was friendly towards them. Another question also arises with these reinforcements. Why were only 20 ships sent, when Athens had more? Given the Peloponnesians' main effort in the Corinthian Gulf, it appears more could have been spared. Our most likely answer to this question probably lays with a lack of funds and manpower. We had seen that the siege of Potidaea had been draining the treasury, while the plague had taken a great toll on Athens' population. Nevertheless, these 20 triremes would set out for their mission to Crete, before then being prepared to sail for Phormio. However, bad weather would delay them even further. Eventually, Sparta had arranged their Peloponnesian fleet back into a fully operational unit, and would sail around the Peloponnese, not far from Naupactus. This time, the fleet would leave its heavy troops on land that would remain in support there. The Peloponnesians now had 77 ships that were ready to give battle, and would be much more manoeuvrable this time around. Across on the other coastline, the Athenians lay at anchor, with only their 20 ships, still waiting reinforcements. Both sides would remain in these positions for the next week, with Phormio not looking to make the first move. After all, he was outnumbered almost 4-1, and he needed to protect Naupactus. Both sides would have to deal with low morale amongst their forces, the Peloponnesians because of the experience of the previous battle, and the Athenians due to the size of the enemy fleet they now faced. However, the commanders of both sides would deliver motivational speeches that would see a fighting spirit rekindled in their men for the coming battle. The Spartans would end up putting in motion the second naval engagement by sailing east along the Peloponnesian coast, with 20 of their best ships making towards Naupactus. The idea here was to force the Athenian ships back into the narrower waters of the Gulf, where their advantage in manoeuvrability would be reduced. Phormio would have rather stayed out in open waters, but the Peloponnesian fleet was now threatening Naupactus, so he had no choice but to mirror the Peloponnesian movements. Once the Athenian fleet was in the narrower part of the Gulf, a signal was given to the Peloponnesians, and the main part of the fleet made a sudden turn towards the Athenian line. The intention here was to cut the Athenians off and prevent their escape into parts where the Gulf widened. The Peloponnesians were not quite quick enough, but would still manage to cut off the Athenian line at its midpoint. 11 Athenian ships would manage to slip the trap, though 9 were cut off from the rest of the line. Here a melee of ships would take place, with the Peloponnesians capturing some ships and men, killing others, while some crews managed to make it to the shore, where their Messenian allies were supporting them from. Remembering here, the Messenians had been given Naupactus as their new home by the Athenians after the Helot revolt in the 460s. Here, in one movement, the Peloponnesians were able to defeat almost half the Athenian fleet. The remaining 11 Athenian ships sailed directly for Naupactus, with 20 of the best Peloponnesian ships in pursuit. 10 of the Athenian ships made it to the port city and prepared themselves defensively to meet the enemy, in what appeared to be a hopeless situation. However, the 11th Athenian vessel had failed to keep pace with the rest for some reason, and it would be this struggler that would be the beginning of a reversal of fortune for the Athenians. The Peloponnesians were sailing towards Naupactus together, singing their paean, Song of Victory, though one of their number was out in front in full pursuit of the Athenian straggler, gaining on it fast. As the straggler came close to the port, a merchant ship could be seen anchored off the coast. The Athenian ship would head towards this ship and then would use it as a shield to protect its flank as it circled around, and would then head straight towards the pursuer, ramming it and sinking it. This action completely took the following Peloponnesians by surprise, and caused all sorts of confusion within their ranks. Some ships would run aground, with their crews probably confused with the orders that they were receiving from their panicked commanders, while the rest would drop their oars to bring their ships to a halt, to grasp the situation and possibly await the main body of the Peloponnesian fleet. However, this pause in activity would now see the initiative taken away from the Peloponnesians. They were now effectively dead in the water. They had taken away their momentum and manoeuvrability, while the Athenians were close at hand and poised to attack. Phormio now saw that this was his best chance to defeat the Peloponnesian fleet. He was still outnumbered 2-1, but his enemy were motionless. The Athenians engaged the Peloponnesians, who only put up a short resistance before turning and retreating, demoralised from the turn of events. They would head back to the shore that had originally set out from, where the rest of the main fleet must have turned and followed their lead, now losing all taste for battle. In the retreat, the Athenians would capture 6 more vessels, and would recover their own that had been disabled in the first part of the battle. This would effectively see the end of the naval action around Naupactus. The Athenians would collect their dead, and would allow the Peloponnesians to collect theirs under an armistice. The Spartan commanders did not want to continue their push on the Athenians, as they had caught wind that Athenian reinforcements were on their way. So during the night, the majority of the Peloponnesian fleet would sail past Naupactus under the cover of darkness, and make their way to the safety of Corinth. The Athenian reinforcements did arrive not long after the battle. Although not arriving in time for the fighting, their imminent arrival had dissuaded the Spartan commanders from launching another offensive. These victories by Phormio were a very big deal to Athens. His skills as a naval commander had meant he was able to defeat a Peloponnesian force of 47 ships in his first engagement, and then one of 77. All the while, he had only 20 ships at his disposal. These victories meant that Naupactus would remain in Athenian possession. It would have been a huge blow to their war effort if it had been lost. While also a defeat at sea for Athens would see their naval reputation damaged, and encourage more enemy amphibious operations. To highlight how important Phormio's efforts were at protecting the port in the west and their reputation, Athens, after his death, would have a statue of Phormio erected on the Acropolis, honouring him. The campaigning season was now coming to a close, but Cinemas and Brasidas were reluctant to return to Sparta with another failure to report. Instead, while in Corinth, they would take a daring plan that had been proposed by the Megarians. They had reported that Athens' main port, the Piraeus, was currently undefended by their navy. If they acted at once, they could launch an attack on the port before the Athenians could get wind of any plans and respond to the threat. While Athens would hardly expect an attack from a force they had beaten twice already, and with winter coming on, this was an unusual time to launch a naval attack. So that the attempt could be launched at once, it was proposed that the rowers of the fleet should all head overland from Corinth to the shore of the Corinthian Gulf, with an oar each and other equipment needed. Awaiting them there were 40 vessels that could be used to carry out the raid. The initial stage of the campaign went as planned, though once on the coast of the Corinthian Gulf with their new fleet, the operation would unravel. Thucydides tells us that the commanders became frightened of the dangers involved in such a raid, while apparently unfavourable winds would also prevent them from making for the Piraeus. The winds may well have been an issue, as with winter approaching, the weather would have not been ideal for sailing. Instead, the fleet would make for the island of Salamis, just off the Attic coastline, where the Peloponnesians would attack and ravage it. However, this action would give warning to Athens of an attack in the region, as when the fleet attacked, beacons had been lit, drawing Athens' attention to what was going on. This had sent Athens into a panic, thinking that they themselves were also under attack. Thucydides points out here that he believes that had the Peloponnesians made for the Piraeus initially, they would have easily taken it. However, once the situation was known to the Athenians, they would arrange a force to march down to the Piraeus, where several ships would be launched, with some forces remaining in port to defend it. The Peloponnesians on Salamis would become aware of the Athenians' counterattack, so they gathered up the plunder and prisoners they had captured, then sailed back to the isthmus and marched back to Corinth, which would now see an end to their naval operations for the year, and returning to Sparta with no news of success. This would see the operations by both Sparta and Athens come to a close for the year. Though, to close out this episode, we are going to quickly look at the developing situation between Thrace and Macedon. Chalcidice, the Thracian king, would launch an attack on Perdiccas, as well as some cities of the Chalcidices. We would hear that the Thracians had a force of 150,000 men, with a third of them being cavalry. Chalcidice would have some initial successes, capturing some cities and fortresses, though the campaign would start to bog down with heavy resistance. The launching of the campaign towards winter also probably didn't help matters. Chalcidice was also still in an alliance with Athens, and apparently it had been arranged that Athens would send a fleet with as many men as possible to help with the attack on the Chalcidices. However, this Athenian fleet would not be forthcoming. This would have also added to the difficulties faced by Chalcidice, as the arrival of the Athenian ships would also probably meant the arrival of supplies. By campaigning in winter, it would be difficult to live off the land, and a great reliance would have been on bringing supplies to the army. We would hear that it would be this lack of food and supplies that would eventually see the Thracian campaign being abandoned. Another point around this campaign that has been hard to know for sure was why the Athenians did not show up to support the Thracians. Thucydides says in his account that the Athenians did not think that the Thracians would make the march. It's hard to know what this exactly means, but perhaps he is suggesting here that the Athenians thought that the campaign would have begun earlier in the season, as it was now November and not an ideal time to be launching a fresh campaign, as well as sailing a fleet over open waters. However, other points can also be raised that could explain Athens' failure to show up. The arrangements for this campaign were made earlier in the year, before the naval actions in the Corinthian Gulf. Perhaps these attacks had made Athens think twice about sending ships off for the north once again, with the resources diverted to meet this threat. Also, sending a large fleet off again would be a costly exercise, and we have seen that Athens' treasury was running low, while there would also have been a manpower crisis because of the plague. So, with what we are given in Thucydides' account, it is hard to pin down the real reason for this failure to assist the Thracians. though I think the points that we have just outlined do make sense, while I also think it is quite possible that the campaign was meant to begin earlier than it had, given this being an unusual time to launch an operation. Given all this, Athens would have been able to reassess their commitment given what had unfolded over the year. This abortive Thracian campaign would bring an end to the activities of the third year of the war. Athens, perhaps not yet at a point of crisis, was still in a position where their ability to fund the continuation of the war was diminishing. It has been estimated that they may have had enough funds to keep up their efforts at full steam for perhaps another year or so. Though if the war was to continue as it was going, they would need to find another way to continue to fund their efforts. The other major factor that Athens was dealing with was a shortage of manpower that the plague had inflicted on them. They had not rid themselves of this added pressure yet, and would have to find ways to mitigate these losses. While on the political front, Pericles had fallen victim to the plague, and was now absent from the political landscape. He had been a figure that Athens had depended upon, even if he hadn't been appreciated at times. Now though, new political figures would emerge to come to the forefront of Athenian political life. It would now be up to them to navigate Athens through the unfolding conflict that still lay ahead. Thank you everyone for your continued support, and a big shout out to all those who have found some value in the series and have been supporting on Patreon and other various ways. Your contribution is truly helping me grow the series. If you've also found some value in the show and wish to support the series, you can head to www.castingthroughancientgreece.com and click on the Support the Series button, where you can discover many ways to extend your support to helping the series grow. Be sure to stay connected and updated on what's happening in the series, and join me over on Facebook or Instagram at Casting Through Ancient Greece, or on Twitter at Casting Greece. And be sure to subscribe to the series over at the Casting Through Ancient Greece website. I hope you can join me next time when we continue the narrative in the series.